Good afternoon. I'm Bill Ashton, the Director of the Rural Development Institute, and welcome to this webinar. We've got people online as well as present in the room. So what we'd like to do is be able to use both the chat for technical questions, so that's at the bottom of your screen, as well as at the bottom of your screen you'll notice a Q&A. So if you've got questions, we'll be taking questions as well. We've got other people that are just walking in, so this is fantastic. We've got a great speaker, and we're going to take this opportunity to get a bit more familiar with the technology that we've got in front of you. So if you haven't used this technology, the idea is that we're going to be making a presentation. You'll see that live in terms of the presentation in front of you. If you've got questions, we'll be holding the questions to the end. But if you've got questions, use the Q&A icon, click on that and type in your questions, and we'll come back and answer those questions in order. For those that are in the room, we'll just ask the questions as you feel free at the end of the presentation. I've also, part of our activity for this series is to allow the involvement of our grad students. So both Mike as well as Otis have created both all of the announcements of this, the flyers for this, the discussions with the speaker. And Otis has agreed to make a presentation in terms of an introduction presentation for our guest speaker today. So I'll turn it over to Otis. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. Welcome once again to our Rural Policy Learning Commons webinar today here in Brandon University. To those of us from the Graduate Master's Program in Rural Development, it is a privilege for us today to have a great speaker in our midst, David McInnes from the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute in Ottawa. It will go a long way to help us in writing proper policy recommendations in our research papers, and also help us in writing our research papers also. So today's webinar is on achieving what's possible for the agri-food policy in Canada through the lens of strategically managing natural capital. So presently, agri-food policy in Canada has always bordered on challenges relating to low productivity, high cost of inputs, lack of modern techniques, and also technology as well, and also the high cost of transportation and delivery costs. But all these challenges have been in the area of social capital and economic capital as well. So challenges such as the loss of arable land due to climate change and also bad farm practices by farmers has been pertinent issues in trying to come up with sustainable policies in agri-food. So today's webinar presentation by David McInnes will shed light on building trust in the agri-food sector, strategically managing natural capital. So David McInnes is the President and Chief Operating Officer of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute in Ottawa, and he's also the Director of Government Relations to the Canadian Bankers Association in Ottawa, and also he's also the second Vice Chair of the Greater Ottawa Chamber of Commerce. So it is our pleasure to have David McInnes today. Thank you.
Thank you, Otis. Thank you. Thank you very much, Otis, and thank you very much for having me here. It's my first time at Brandon University, and I drove today from Winnipeg and didn't go off the road in the snow. So it's really good to be here safe and sound, and it's a beautiful university. So thanks for having me. Just very quickly, I thought I would give you a sense of who CAPI is, the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're an independent, not-for-profit NGO, think tank that's looking at the future prospects for the Canadian agri-food sector. And we're trying to create research and dialogue on issues that are important in order, hopefully, for this incredible sector to succeed in the future. And I'm delighted that there's so many people online and people in the room here, and hopefully we can have a conversation after I go through a bit of a presentation on some of our recent thinking and some of our recent work. So let me just make sure this arrow works here. Otis, I'm going to need your help again. to advance this. I could tell you what I saw on my way from Winnipeg to Brandon, but I'm sure you don't want to be, you're not interested in that. So maybe, oh, there we go. Okay, thank you, Otis. I could have pressed that button too. I don't know what happened. Okay. Obviously, high technology is a big thing at this university. So this is a piece of work. This is a title of a report that we published last February, and it was based on a lot of work in thinking around what the future of the agri-food sector holds. And so I'm going to be lifting some of the core ideas from this piece of work, which is available on our website, in order to share with you some ideas today. The central idea, though, is that how we cultivate trust may very well be the key to our future competitiveness. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit and hopefully explore that and really try to understand why we think trust is one of the most important things facing the Canadian agri-food sector. The two core ideas, though, behind it and explored in this report is how do we enhance natural capital and how do we improve nutritional quality are the two pillars of what we mean around how can we enhance trust. And I'm going to get into this a little bit with you today. But perhaps when I think of both of those concepts, and I'll make this connection soon, a little bit later on in this presentation, but actually valuing and managing natural capital probably or perhaps should be our #1 policy priority. So what do I mean by natural capital? Well, it's like your bank account, and you have money in your account, you draw it down to buy goods and services, and hopefully with a job you replenish it, or gifts, but you can also go into debt. You can draw it down and go into deficit. You can depreciate what you have. It's a very similar concept to our soil, water, biosystems, and other forms of natural capital. We can maintain it, manage it, enhance it even, improve upon it, but we can also draw it down as we produce food, and we can depreciate it, as you'll see, in terms of how we live and how we use our natural capital. There's 3 core ideas I want to leave with you today, and that is that attention globally, nationally, and even locally to natural capital is rising. And there's a whole lot of new requirements and expectations. I'm going to touch on this in my piece today. The second idea, core idea, is that many countries are actually going to struggle with how they produce food in the future, and we're seeing it today, and how they manage their natural capital. And while there are all sorts of good examples, again, I'll touch on this, about the responding to the challenge, we do believe that as the agri-food production systems continue, there's going to be increasing scrutiny and mistrust about how we use natural capital. The third core idea is that this could be, and is, we believe, Canada's comparative advantage. How we manage our own natural capital is critical, but we also are a global player. We're a big exporter. We are part of global and national supply chains. So there's a lot of complexity in how we meet those expectations and requirements, remain competitive, and how do we differentiate using this natural capital, which I'm going to end on. I also want to touch a little bit about improving nutritional quality. Most of the conversation today in this piece is going to be about natural capital, but I do want to touch on this. This is a very complex issue, and here's an interesting slide around the prospective budget for the province of Ontario by 2022. Healthcare spending for this province, and like many other provinces in the country, if not globally, because of demographics, is going to rise considerably. And as the budget gets consumed more by dealing with healthcare costs, less monies are for other things. So as we deal with aging societies, increasing disease, diet-related disease, obesity, these are key drivers. And so when we think of nutritional quality, often we think in terms of diet and healthcare costs. Very important and a big issue. But there's another side to nutritional quality, and that is, how do we understand the link between how we grow our food and what's in our soil, and at a very micro level, the bacteria and the biome of that soil? How do we link that to the animal and the human gut biome and our own health? Can we make that connection? This is an emerging area of work for us. We're exploring this right now. I'm not going to get into this in this presentation, but this is a huge potential area where we can better understand the link to nutritional quality, in addition to diet and managing healthcare costs and other things that I mentioned. So I'd like to start with the consumer. And consumer concerns and expectations are rising from everywhere from this room and your own eating habits and families to around the world. But there are also some opportunities. So I could have chosen many, many different slides, but here's one. This is a slide of a campaign. It's a global campaign called Meatless Mondays, encouraging people not to eat meat on Mondays, thereby improving allegedly your health and allegedly the planet. Now, there's a lot of controversy around this. But this is an indication of what the global food system is dealing with. And there's a lot of examples we could have touched on, and I'm going to get into that in a bit. As we think of those issues, we've divided them up into 4 categories: provenance, ethics, health, and sustainability. So wait for it. This is going to be a busy slide. Next one. But as we think of the many, many issues, and I'm sure we can add many more to this slide, consumers are linking the issues around where their food comes from, provenance, what's in their food, how is it grown, is it bad for me, is it good for my family, bad for the planet, is it harm animals, or the ethics around how we produce and grow our food, including people who work on farms or who help us address food security issues. There are many food issues, and we, consumers and supply chains, are connecting the dots on all of them. This is what the global food system is doing and trying to grapple with. But let's not forget, this is not only a critique, perhaps, of the global food system or criticism, but there's opportunity. And this is fascinating. This is an award, the Guinness World Record, that actually went to Alibaba, the largest online company in China, for selling the most liters of milk in one actual day. The why I put this here is that Chinese consumers, particularly the growing middle and upper class of China, are searching the world for high quality, safe, nutritious foods and beverages. And so food safety, lack of trust in China's own food system has driven the online platforms. So mistrust can actually create an economic opportunity to satisfy that. I'd like to turn a little attention now from the individual consumer to the NGOs, the non-government organizations that are playing a role. Many examples, again, could have been chosen. I'm just going to look at what the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, has done in terms of scrutinizing how retailers and processors of palm oil, in this case a scorecard of some 137 global companies, and soy, looking at EU companies and how they source those products sustainably or not. And the intent here is to bring greater transparency and metrics to the whole sustainability picture, trying to raise the bar, if you will, on scrutiny. But it's also in the nutrition field, not just sustainability. This is another scorecard of some 22 global companies, and you can see the list on your screen, called the Access Nutrition Index. How are these companies contributing to improving nutrition and reducing obesity? And so the visibility and metrics around performance are increasing. And there's many more, I should add. The scrutiny is only going to intensify. As we look at many different views of ecosystem challenge, and here's one, these are, we start to see that there's incredible concern and scrutiny around how we produce our food. This is dead zones in the world's oceans and water systems caused in part or large degree from fertilizer. And you can see the highlighted red and what that might mean for public trust, for example, of how we produce our food. But there's also an intense effort underway to document and try to bring some real academic rigor to understanding the challenge. And so this was a study done looking at how the Midwestern United States, and the blue mark there, tattoo if you will, is the Ogallala Aquifer, and how it's being drawn down in order to largely irrigate crops, and the economic cost to one state alone, Kansas, in terms of that depletion rate. So in other words, what they're trying to document here is we're producing food today at the expense of our natural capital for tomorrow. And is that truly sustainable? Here's another view, and we shouldn't think that while Canada is blessed with lots of land, water, and resources, we too are facing our own stresses. And these are two images of the algae blooms on Lake Erie, which is a shared border, obviously, with the United States, and Lake Winnipeg. But it's important to note that while agriculture is a contributor, it's not the only contributor. And often the dialogue misses the point that it's industrial applications, urbanization, as well as cross-border watersheds. All of these things, among others, contribute to this particular problem. So scrutiny also has market access consequences. And I'm just going to give a couple of views here. And this is a fascinating one that happened last March in 2016 with respect to Chile. And Chile suffered, I guess, a collision of events which resulted in a huge economic loss for its farm salmon. The runoff from the land due to some heavy storms put a lot of phosphates and fertilizer and so forth into the ocean. Then the warming ocean caused a huge bloom. That created a stressed habitat. The aquaculture industry responded by trying to add antibiotics to the water, to the pens, and that resulted in some closures to the US market, resulting in an $800 million loss to the Chilean salmon fishery. So in other words, you look at a health, environmental, climate change, food production, access to market, economic issue, and they all collide into one story. And this is playing out actually around the world. Another market access issue is Canadian canola. And in order to get to Europe, the Europeans have required that anything that is grown, this is canola is being used for the bioenergy sector, it must come from or grown from land that's not been previously or recently deforested. And so there is now an obligation to demonstrate sustainability in order to ensure trade. So in response to some of those, and we could probably come up with quite a list of those stresses and the scrutiny, a lot of global action is occurring to try to respond and deal with and improve the management of these various stresses. For one, and this is well known, is what happened in Paris. And so now the global economy has commitments around lowering greenhouse gas emissions. Now, recent developments in the United States is a big wild card in terms of what's going to happen there. But nevertheless, we have a massive global effort to try to deal with managing greenhouse gas emissions, and individual governments and sub-governments, such as provinces, are also falling into line and responding to the challenge. The global effort has an even bigger step, if you can think of it that way, and this is this represents the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 goals with many hundred individual targets to try to improve water, access to water and sanitation, reduce poverty, address hunger, address social issues, economic vibrancy, urbanization challenges, a whole lot of goals occupied or dominated by, set out by the UN by 2030. I put this in here for actually a couple reasons. One is it shows the global effort underway to try to address some of these huge pan-global issues. But I put it in here for a policy reason for Canada. And we might think of the SDGs as largely a matter for international development, for example, how we may deliver our international aid and how we might conform or help to advance some of these individual goals. But over time, what's going to happen is that individual companies and governments will start really measuring their progress and success to deliver on these. And as global supply chains respond, and they are already responding, in fact, we're going to see an impact on domestic policy. And so what might have been in the domain of international development and global trade could soon start to, over time, infiltrate, if you will, or influence domestic policy as we become more ingrained in how to try to respond to these global metrics. Another key factor that's taking place, and this doesn't get a lot of visibility, at least in the broad popular press, but the G20, the governors of the banks of the G20 and finance ministers have set a course to try to address climate risk. And their view, and this is of course Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of Canada, a Canadian, he said that we need to look at not only the business cycle, not only the political cycle, but we need to look at the climate change or sustainability cycle. And we need to understand what's happening, because this is having a profound impact on the balance sheets of companies and governments, frankly, as to how they respond to climate shocks. And so this, I believe, will really start to influence access to credit issues, access to insurance, business risk management programming, even our pensions and investments, as we start to assess the risk of climate change and environmental shocks and pressures around the world. I put this in here because I want to make sure that when we think of what those consumers are responding to, or those NGOs are responding to, that we just don't put that into a space where we think, well, that's reactionary and global advocacy at work, and it's to be minimized. This is an economic issue as well as a consumer issue. And so this is a very key indicator, in my view, that we are really in new territory as we think about how we're managing and responding to sustainability and natural capital. So I just want to remind you of why we're part of this discussion. And we think that Canada's natural capital advantages could potentially be a huge opportunity for us as we respond to this very complex world that I tried to share with you just a second ago. And so what is happening? How is the food sector responding? Well, this is a well-known company, Unilever, that's actually declared that it could double profits and half its environmental footprint by 2020. It's now looking to source many key commodities 100% sustainably around the world. This is driving change in both the developed and the developing world. If you walk into your grocery store here in Canada, and perhaps I know in Europe and the United States and perhaps around the world, we're seeing more and more sustainably sourced seafood in the freezer or in the fresh shelf. And so what is happening is that grocery chains are responding to the sustainability call and are affecting supply chains for the sourcing of their products. There are initiatives, and there are several, such as the Roundtable on Responsible Soy, trying to source product more responsibly. This is a global effort, including Brazil and the United States and Canada, trying to develop better metrics and understand the impacts of soy production. But rest assured that simply because there's an initiative to try to be proactive, criticism continues. And this is a group, actually it was a coalition of groups called Friends of the Earth, which called this particular certification program a rubber stamp and a smoke screen. So scrutiny and criticism and transparency is only going to increase. Companies and supply chains are also looking for Canada for a certain degree for leadership and action. And here's a few examples. This is another roundtable called the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And Cargill and McDonald's look to Canada to embark upon its first sustainable beef pilot in order to demonstrate and verify how sustainable beef could be raised and enter into the supply chain. And Canada was the first country to receive such a pilot, demonstrating, I think, its leadership. The pulse sector is a well-known important commodity, but it's also trying to add value and repositioning itself to some degree by demonstrating that how it can reformulate pastas, crackers, breads, and other such products by adding a certain amount of in this case, pea powder to that product, thereby increasing the health nutrition impact, fiber or protein, and they also link it to the climate change sustainability impact in terms of the carbon footprint, adding value by bringing nutrition and natural capital together. General Mills of Canada, which sources 100% of its oats, by the way, from Canada for, as you can see the product here, Cheerios. Why I introduced this is that this is also, when we think of how we manage natural capital, this is about a supply reliability issue. If there's a disruption to the crop, or to the oat supply, then this has impact, of course, for the supply chain right to the consumer shelf or the grocer shelf. And then a little closer to what's happening in Manitoba is that we have McInnes, and there's others, that other larger processors that are introducing their sustainability scorecard, and to try to demonstrate that transparency, but what they are trying to do working with growers to enhance the sustainability footprint. So what are some of the policy responses? That's what the companies and some of the supply chains are doing. I'm going to spend a minute on this. Well, in Canada, we've seen some interesting developments. Government mandate letters, which are what ministers refer to in terms of how they will conduct their activities in the department for the period of time that they're there, are now starting to link agendas. And these are being made public. It's been happening here in Manitoba. It's happening federally. And this is a new initiative. It conforms to this notion of being transparent, but also to a new, I think, a new way of thinking about the system. No longer is it agri-food policy and environment policy, although there's still some more work that can be done there, or health policy, or transportation policy. These policies need to be linked. And an example of this, for example, is linking health, nutrition, and food objectives, and then ALICE, which is an alternative land use program to help encourage sustainability on farm. There's also some initiatives underway, in fact, a big initiative to launch a national food policy. We have yet to really see what that means, but the intent is to start to look at how a variety of policy domains are being cross-referenced in one overarching strategy. This is just nascent and being lifted off the ground. And then, of course, when we think of individual governments supporting local, each one of us like to buy local food. And so there's a real economic imperative to support the local grower, producer, rancher, processor, and retailer. And because the governments are trying to foster and support that. Even though we're a big commodity export country, local food is still very important. Governments also respond through regulation. And this is, of course, but what's interesting is that they're trying to address and stay current with emerging risks, perceived risks, actual risks, and anticipate what the science is going in terms, and in this case, it's consulting on phasing out so-called neonics that are used in the grain sector. And this just came out just before Christmas. Government, of course, coming back to that nutrition issue, are trying to encourage improved diets, better education, reaching out to younger consumers, labeling, even advertising restrictions. This is another way that governments enter the agri-food space by trying to connect some of these dots. I mentioned greenhouse gases and the environmental platform, the Paris 21, COP21, and this is resulting in carbon pricing initiatives across the country and around the world. But we shouldn't forget that how governments are responding, supporting research and academic work in soil research is a big part of how can we respond to climate change without having a better idea of what's in our soil and how the soil can be a carbon fixer, sequester. So governments are involved in supporting this. A key issue that hasn't been discussed is who owns our resources. And as a climate world gets more intense, as stresses increase, as droughts persist, I don't want to be casting too bleak a picture, but nevertheless, as change and stress continues, who's going to have access and own and control our land, our farmland, our water, fresh water? And so this issue will probably come about with some high-profile foreign purchase of an asset here in Canada. And so this will put it right back on the front burner, in my view. This actual image, I should have explained, was a first. This was a town called Waukesha, which is just outside of Milwaukee in the United States. It got permission to draw from Lake Michigan. The first time there was an interbasin transfer of Great Lakes water. They were going to use it, recycle it, and return it. So they were borrowing water, but it was a first. And the mayors on the Canadian and US side banded together to advocate against this, because it sets a precedent as to where this water goes. So watch this space. So we have water, we have soil, we have good governance, we have good regulations. There's always challenges there, but essentially we're a credible player. Are we leveraging our advantages? And are we being strategic with what we have, given what we think is a changing food world? So these two maps are going to be a little dated, given recent events, but they do make a point. And this is a representational map of free trade agreements in the year 2000 with Canada, between Canada, the US, and the EU. And then only a short 15 years later, this is what the free trade agreements looked like. Now, who knows where we'll go with a Trump presidency, but actually it doesn't matter where the lines are today or in this map. The point is that there'll probably be a whole lot of individual and maybe other types of regional trade agreements. And the real message I want to share here is not to predict where those lines are, but how does any country and how does Canada differentiate itself in a world that's increasingly linked by either global supply chains and supplying of ingredients and in various types of trade agreements. The other thing that I'd like to talk about in terms of our Canadian advantage that sort of builds on that stage that's been set is we shouldn't dismiss the importance of winter. And that is, it's a natural pesticide. And when we think of the story of our pesticide use, we actually have one of the lowest profiles of pesticide use. This is a slide showing kilos per hectare. Some of our competitors and customers and suppliers have a far higher profile. So the question is, and this, by the way, that this fingerprint, if you will, would be higher in certain regions in Canada than others, so it's an average. But does this have merit in terms of how we brand Canadian food? What should we be doing about this? We also talked a lot about Canada's vast open spaces, and we talk about, again, our water and our good soil. So how do we actually put something behind that to demonstrate that? And this is a slide that was developed that looks at the ratio of animals and humans to arable land. And the denser in red, the denser the higher that ratio, the greater the risk and the density of the interaction between animals and humans, and hence the spread of zoonotic diseases. And so given that Canada fares really well, and we often talk about Canada having broad open spaces and good water, but how do we leverage and put some serious metrics behind this? What's our strategic opportunity? In fact, one group called the Global Footprint Network has tried to do this, and they have put metrics around many countries around the world around who's using the resources, what's renewably available, that is what's renewably available within their borders. And I'm just going to choose two countries, the United States, which is in deficit in red, and this is an indication of their biocapacity versus their ecological footprint, and Canada in green. So we might think this is a great story, and it is, but look at the trend line for Canada. So we have this incredible endowment, but are we truly managing it as strategically as we should? And so we have to be very careful not to rest on our laurels. So I think it's clear, in our thinking it is, that attention to natural capital and nutrition is rising. Many countries around the world are going to struggle and increasingly in producing food and managing that their natural capital. And again, this is our big opportunity. And so perhaps it is time that we change the conversation on natural capital. And this caption says, in the future, global warming will affect small talk, as someone's hanging on for dear life. So how can we position Canada then as an agri-food economic powerhouse with this in mind? Well, I think it's clear that against the backdrop that we've set, Canada's natural capital advantages could really be our strategic advantage or opportunity. But rest assured, scrutiny is only going to increase, and there's greater accountability around that, and governance will be put increasingly under pressure. But here's a concept that if we want to address some of these issues, I think the message I've been trying to share with you is really there's a systems integration taking place. Health, soil, climate change, global supply chains, things are coming together. And you saw those sustainable development goals linking poverty to access to water, to economic opportunity, to urban environments. And so increasingly, like the government's mandates letters, but we need to go much beyond. How are we linking the policy agendas that we face, and how systematic are we in doing so? And so as I think our future is about, and we're known to be good collaborators here in Canada, I think our future is about how we can really link up these agendas, and not to overwhelm anybody in the marketplace with unnecessary regulation. That's not the prescription. But how do we drive policy alignment? How do we enhance that collaboration across the food system? And I mean food system well beyond the supply chain, growers, processors, retailers, but the health community, environment community, financial services, 3 levels of government, the technology providers, information management. This is what the food system is relying increasingly on in order to cope with change. And of course, what are those credible metrics? Because transparency is rising. And so I think to conclude, where we are is that Canada has a tremendous opportunity to really express, in our view, a really bold destination about what we can contribute and what we can do with our agri-food sector in the 21st century. And that is essentially how do we deliver huge economic benefits while also linking to societal benefits and based on our natural capital advantages. It's ours to define. So thank you very much for your time, and to those online, thank you for joining, and I'd be delighted to share in your questions or answer any questions you have.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David. That was a really great presentation. I just have one question here from Kathleen, and she'd like to, from the producer's perspective, she'd like to know what you think can be done to reduce the harm and also the illness caused from food production on the producer side.
To reduce the, can you just
all the illness and the harm, and also the loss to the environment caused by producers?
Well, producers produce food that we eat every day. So I think the producers are an incredibly important part of our ability to live and survive, and they are very good stewards of the land. I think what's happening though is producers around Canada, around the world, are trying to grapple with profound change, whether it's new pests, whether it's droughts, extreme events, extreme heat, and they're also trying to ensure that they can get an adequate revenue for the work that they put in to their farms or their ranches or their orchards every day. And so the pressure on a producer is pretty profound. The other thing that's happening is that these standards I mentioned, whether it's from the local retailer, grocery store, to the global supply chain, are putting in place safety, sustainability, quality, even animal care and ethics of farm worker requirements on producers. And so I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but producers have to manage all of those requirements, plus still go out at that every morning and do what they have to do to put food in our plates. So I think the premise of the question actually is not right. I think the premise of the question that somehow producers are at fault, I think is not the right approach. There are probably producers who could do better, but I think what we need to do to tackle these profoundly complex issues is actually to have producers, processors, retailers, regulators, and researchers actually come together a little more frequently to address this complexity so that we can have good quality, safe, sustainable foods every day. I think that's the real focus, and thanks for that question though.
Yeah, and she'd also like to know how specialists can expand their capacity in order to promote food security.
Specialists, what type of specialists?
Specialists in regarding to all the stakeholders involved in food production.
Well, I'll take it this way. I think what one of the gaps that I see is there's a tremendous amount of research and academic work that's being done. I'll just talk about Canada, but certainly true around the world. There's a tremendous amount. One of the tasks that we all have in the policy space is how do we pull that good research and the good data out so it can be applied. Academics spend a lot of time focused on publishing in their academic journals that companies, governments, and others simply don't have access to, they may not understand, and they might not know what's timely or not. And I'm not being critical of the academic community. I'm just stating that there's a lot of work being done, and how do we bring that out? There's ways of doing that. Conferences, of course, being one venue to bring people together. But I think that academia and researchers have a big role in helping companies and governments try to solve for some of these issues, or at least better inform. And getting those channels out there, developing those channels for that information to get out there is very important. You'll notice that there was a big theme that went through our observations, and that is there's increasing transparency from you as a consumer, from the supply chains, whether it's a Loblaws or a Sobeys or a retailer, Nestle or someone more local. They need data. And so the academic community, the researching community can really help support that. So there's a vital role for a greater integration of academia research in this picture.
Thanks a lot, David. I'd like to put a question
Thank you.
to the floor if anyone has a question.
It's being recorded.
Yes, there's a microphone, right?
I think we're all agreed that to fully understand what's achievable in the agri-food sector, we have to understand those complex linkages between agri-food policies, economic policies, environmental policies, health policies. But I'm a little concerned because I think there's an aspect of social policy which seems to be missing here. And that aspect is food security. Because it will not matter how much capital we maintain or gain in our agri-food resources and how vibrant our economies become as a result of that. If we do not address what I see as the principal motive behind food production, which is ensuring safe access, good food for everyone, then it's too little available. And we also recognize that food security, the issue of hunger especially, has very little to do with how much food we produce. Right now, we produce enough food that everyone on this planet could be quite fat. But at the same time, we see these graphic evidence of hunger and malnutrition. Where does that aspect of it fall into our agri-food achievement?
I think it's the essential issue. And in fact, when you read materials, and I've seen this in many, many cases, there's a lot of work, a lot of people say, how do we feed this growing hungry world and a growing population of, 8 billion people by 2050? The question actually is missing a key word. How do we sustainably feed a growing planet, a growing population by whatever the date? And whether we think of the shrimp farms in Thailand that have raised mangroves, we look at the soy farms and palm farms in Indonesia or Brazil that have raised rainforests, whether we think of Canada's cod fishery that was overfished, we can go through every country and see what's happening. And so it's how do we sustainably feed ourselves, which is it's the essence of food security. And so while I might not have used the word food security, it is come through in the Sustainable Development Goals and some of the other pieces. It is at its core the essence of it. In inner cities or in large cities or in certain communities, such as in Northern Canada, or even in rural Canada, the issue of food security has a different dimension. And so that's also important. And what that brings in, and I believe you said it, is that this might be more of an issue of what is our social policy around food, as opposed to policy around maximizing sustainable yield and production. And so that's where this national food policy, I might not have said it, but it was supposed to have been there. It does introduce some of these issues about access and affordability of food. And I think herein lies the complexity, is that food touches probably every single policy file, and it touches all of us, and it touches everything. Think of water, think of carbon, think of an economy. And so that's the big challenge with food policy, is will this be so weighty and so interconnected that in fact we won't make many gains in trying to advance the yardstick. So that's the challenge that policymakers have, what's in scope and what's out of scope. And I think that's in part why the Sustainable Development Goals, quite admirably tried to link what they did to try to segment out how they address complex issues. Maybe there's something to learn from that. Yes?
So do you see any way to have incentives for both consumers and producers in a short term? Because that makes sense. What you're saying makes sense, and I really like the idea, and I think that's the kind of direction everybody would agree on. But then, unfortunately, this kind of market-oriented kind of system we have, economic system we have. So who makes more money is the way that everybody's kind of chasing after, unfortunately. So there is some point that we need to, like maybe social policy or some way to regulate, but then something that we need to stop this cycle. So then think about the long term, think about sustainability, think about future generation, think about our health and all sorts of stuff. But then we don't really see the short term reason. Now we have to do it, otherwise tomorrow will be different. We just don't have that kind of.
Yeah, thank you. Great question, and there's a lot of different ways to answer it. One point I didn't bring out in my piece that we're actually doing some work on is looking at global agricultural subsidies. And these are policies, so I'm picking up on one aspect of the incentive issue, is that global subsidies, some of which are beneficial and actually serve important uses, but in other cases, what we're starting to understand is that they're encouraging overproduction while drawing down on natural capital. And so they're sustaining or persisting the cycle that we have. And as a result, Canada, which is faring better than most in terms of how it's managing its natural capital, but nevertheless, we're unable to leverage our unique opportunities and get scale for what we produce because we're fighting against, we're trading against other countries that continue to use big subsidies in order to produce. And so it's hard to get a reasonable price. As a result of that, what's happening is we're seeing that the actual price and cost of food is not incorporating the ecological impact. And so I think what's happening now is you're seeing this tremendous activity around understanding what really sustainable sourcing is all about, is it's starting to bring that to the forefront. And so I think there's a lot of change. Now there's a lot that's not happening, the glass, in my view, is half full. I think there's been a lot of progress. So that's one aspect of the incentive piece. There's a very complex issue, though.
Yep. And maybe one question online. Matthew would like to know if you see any link between strategic management of Canada's natural capital and Canada's First Nations communities.
Well, I think the First Nation communities have a tremendous role in this story as users and stewards of the land and water themselves. And again, there's different ways to look at this. There's some really interesting examples of First Nations producers and processors who are doing well and branding themselves on the quality of the product that they produce, whether it's a winery in British Columbia or it's processed foods in this province. So I think First Nations have an economic opportunity. I think also First Nations, we should learn about philosophically from where they have been, and that is that we need to manage our landscape differently and put greater value on that. So I think there's different ways that we can learn from that community.
And also,
okay. I was thinking of, again, the economic and societal bit there.
I'm just wondering if you have a microphone. Does that get picked up? I'm not sure. So, thank you.
Yeah, so in relation to the economic, societal, and the competitiveness, I was just wondering if, like, which angle is kind of the one to take of whether we should be looking at how to lower the prices for good food when compared for, like, the ballot and go pay 49 cents for a thing of Mr. Noodles, or I could pay like $1.50 for like Campbell's or a better version of soup. Is it parts that we should be looking to how we can lower local food prices, or is that more of like a wage government issue?
So there's two pieces to that. One, and I'll start with the second. That if we want to improve access to healthier food, it's an incomes issue, and it's an affordability issue, and so which is social policy driven. And so we have not looked into that because that hasn't been our prime mandate, but we are certainly aware that that's a key driver. So I take your point, but we just haven't done a lot of looking into that. On the front part of your question is about local food, and what's interesting is you might recall when organic food first entered the marketplace. I won't try to guess at how many years ago it was, but it wasn't that long ago where organic was trendy, it was niche, it was expensive, and it was seen with great curiosity. Well, organic is mainstream. You go into any grocery store and you're not necessarily paying a premium for organic. It's mainstream product. The issue around organic is, do we have real clarity on what is genuinely organic? What are the metrics and the governance protocols and the transparency around what's truly organic or not? So we can have that discussion. But the point is that the marketplace does respond. And I think the organic issue, whether you choose organic or not, whether you like it or not, the marketplace is responding to where the consumer wants to go. Sometimes it's not fast enough. And so there's a lot of interesting opportunities, I think, in the marketplace to drive change. And as I tried to show with some of the global and national companies, there's a tremendous amount of response. But I think it's putting even greater scrutiny on how we're measuring and declaring things, making claims in the name of sustainability or ethics or health or nutrition, which is going to be more intense.
So I have another question here. This one, you would like to know how we can change the perception of people from viewing farmers as lower class citizens to actually trusting them with the system you are describing.
Well, I've seen some research where, in fact, farmers, from a public opinion standpoint and who has access, or excuse me, how they're viewed, farmers are held in extremely high esteem and are often seen as a highly trustworthy spokespeople for their practices and for the environment or for the practices that they're talking about. So I'm not sure, but I'm sure as if we were all looking the internet, we'd all find we'd probably find a producer where some practice was exposed, or we'd find a processor or somebody else. So there's always going to be those cases, but public opinion research actually reveals that farmers are highly trustworthy. And in a way, it's based and there's a good reason for that, is producers want to produce. They want to produce high quality, good food. They're trying to maximize their income, and they want to be able to put a crop in or raise their animals for the next year. And so they are driven to be good stewards. The question is, are they at the leading edge of practices that are trying to address where the market's going? And that's where we need to have a conversation around producers, retailers, and processors coming together to try to grapple with these expectations for the consumer. And so I think doesn't mean just because you've been a good steward before, you get licensed to do what you're going to do in the future. I think the scrutiny on everyone is going to increase.
Can I just have a follow-up question on that? And I know you worked in this area, you talked about this area of social license. And I think it links directly back to your answer there. Can you just talk a little bit about the sort of dimensions that from your organization that you see important, directly connected to this natural capital?
Well, yes, thanks, Bill. I think one of the first slides or the first line in our presentation and our thinking is that cultivating trust is actually the number one, the number one priority, and that's how we manage natural capital. Because it's such a fundamental, if we don't manage that well, people will have great mistrust in what you do to produce food. Why would I choose to put a piece of seafood on my plate for dinner tonight where I'm not sure of how it got there? I'm not sure whose life it may have destroyed, what forest, mangrove might have been cut down, or whatever. I'm taking this a little extreme, but the point is that we're more and more concerned about where our food comes from. It's a trust issue. And so how we manage natural capital and ensure safe food and sustainable food, I think is at its heart a matter of trust. I would like to comment, though, on the notion of social license and public trust, is that often the discussion in Canada, and I won't talk about elsewhere, but I suspect it's the same, is that often we hear it's about, well, we just need to better inform the consumer that what we're doing is right. We just need to challenge the social media advocates and get our own story out there. We just need scientists and experts and good farmers to put on the TV or on social media to respond and counter the misinformation that apparently is out there. I think while there's always an important role to communicate better and to try to present facts and science and to be a better spokesperson perhaps, this is not a communications campaign. This is about getting as best as we can good data and solid metrics around performance. It's a governance issue. If it's deemed to be merely a public relations issue, the sector will have lost before it has started. But that's not to say that you can't ensure good public relations, good communications. You've got to be in that space. Otherwise, your message will be manipulated by those who are ideologically driven. They don't care what you have to say, or they ignore certain facts. So you need both. But public trust is not merely to be equated with information campaigns. It's about data and governance.
Just going back to what Dr. Spencer's question.
I think you might, excuse me, I think you might need to use the microphone. Sorry.
My question is on what are the policies in place to solve food waste in the domestic and commercial sectors? Because once we lose the link between throwing food, we also lose our focus on trying to reduce the depletion of natural capital. So what are the policies in place to solve these issues in terms of the ever-increasing population in the world right now?
Well, I think technology is going to play a huge role, which actually has, there's two sides to this story. So technology is going to be increasingly used, for example, DNA fingerprinting to see whether I don't know why I've got fish in my mind, but to see whether a piece of fish or a piece of meat is what it is. Am I eating swordfish tonight, or is that something else, another species? So getting the DNA fingerprint and understanding what we're doing is a matter of dealing with food fraud, which is a huge issue. So technology is going to enable us to deal with, and I'm picking one risk, which is food fraud. And on the other hand, when we use technology that can reveal trace elements of contaminants in foods that were otherwise, apparently, according to other previous standards, safe, and now it's revealing certain contaminants, that food may be still ultra safe, but because the technology is getting so incredibly fine, there is nothing that will have zero contaminants. And so people are maybe getting worried about what's in their food when really there is no case for food safety concerns. And so what we're seeing is that technology can be very enabling on the one hand, but can actually perhaps raise more fears on the other. And so there's a real technology literacy issue here, both from policymakers and in our education sector. How are we adapting, accepting, challenging appropriately technology so we ask the right questions, so that we can put in place the best policy and responses. So policy needs to stay current with the changing nature of technology.
Another question from here. Sia would like to know whether free trade in agri-produce can lead to lowering of global environmental and labor standards.
Would you mind just repeating that for me, please?
You would like to know whether free trade in agricultural products can lead to global environmental standards.
Well, right now there are trade agreements around the world for all sorts of products, including agri-food and beverages, and these are complemented by so trade agreements often are about how do you reduce the tariffs to get in and out of a country, and there are other certain other standards that might be part of that. Quotas in terms of accessing the country with a certain amount of product. These are often complemented by standards set by global food organizations and by supply chains, which often can be deemed to be non-tariff barriers when they actually put up a barrier, even though you might have a free trade agreement with a country. And so these global standards can actually play real havoc with the free movement and trade of goods, even though under the guise of safety, for example, but may in fact just be more about protectionism. And so I guess it all comes back to what is free in terms of free trade, and do we really understand that? And the role of standards plays is incredibly important. On the other hand, global standards enable us to get an incredible array of diverse, safe foods on our plates every day. And so standards aren't by their nature bad, but they can be manipulated. And so we have to, as a country, and a view that we've purported, is that we have to be really good at being around those tables when those standards are being developed. And as most countries should, we need to really understand what's the motivation behind a standard. Are they adding undue costs? Are they truly getting at the problem that's been defined? And so we have to be really sharp diplomatically and working with the commodity sectors and others in the sector, in the food system, to make sure that those standards are really, the objectives that we're setting are the objectives that are being addressed.
Any other questions? Okay, last one.
You mentioned about the more data needed, and also already their data or research studies are done, but then public or producers don't have the better access to understand or learn.
Yes.
So what do you, what are the, what is the kind of studies that you recognize more to be done? For the data, it's already studied, but then what type of information that we academics
Yeah.
need to have a better access, or we need to make it a little bit more, I don't know, voice louder.
Yeah, it's a good question. We've actually tried to think that through a bit. So academic freedom is very important, and discovery and inquiry is very important. So we're not saying that somehow that should be thrown away with, but there is something to say about what are Canada's strategic opportunities in the future for the agri-food space. What is our destination? What are we aiming to achieve other than to continue to provide jobs and grow our food sustainably, which are both very important. But what are we aiming to achieve? So if we're aiming to achieve to be a global powerhouse in a world that's going to be becoming increasingly stressed and skeptical of the food and ingredients that people eat, and we have a place and role where we can truly enhance ecosystems and improve nutritional quality because of what Canada represents, can that actually create a real vision for the country that sets a signal for supply chains, for governments, for academia, and scientists to work together in a far greater collaborative, more systemic way, perhaps incented by research dollars, in order to help deliver on that vision? That doesn't mean to say at the expense of everyone's work and somehow we're all going to be in the same rowboat rowing the same way at the same speed all the time. But for a country with so much potential as Canada, with access to abundant fresh water, good governance, always needing tweaking, but good governance and good land and a future world that's going to want sustainable food, that's a vision that could align us a lot better. And maybe that will attract those investments and those dollars from global suppliers and others from around the world to come to Canada and invest in what we've got here. That's worth coordinating around. That's what we're hoping that this could be the vision for Canada in the 21st century. It's ours to grab hold of and design, and I hope we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for giving me the opportunity, and thank you to those online and to those in the room for having me in Brandon. Thank you.
Thank you. David, I've heard you a couple times both speak and talk about this connection from, because we've tested him from detailed questions all the way to the ending with the big vision question. And for me, what's really important about your institute is that you have people like yourself, as well as your board members and others, and your publications speak to this, to be able to take something that might be local and reasonably simple, food, growing something, and move it into a discussion that's not only just national, but is connected to global, and then back again to say, what should we be doing about policy in this area? And that, to me, is one of the huge strengths as an institute that we've got in Canada. So I do want you to know that we just greatly appreciate you being here today. We want to give you a gift.
Thank you.
To record your reflections. It's old school, it's writing. But for those online, I've just handed him a leather-bound book that allows him to do that. So I just greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks, everybody.
You can get us off line. David has suggested that he's interested in going for a beer afterwards, so if anybody wants